big fight was against structural adjustment. But what they were trying to do was to get the same principles as structural adjustment and then institutionalize it forever for countries that want to have predictability regarding their trade tariffs vis-a-vis other countries. So not all countries fall into external debt and therefore get into structural adjustment, but all countries trade and want to have certainty on trade. And the European Union at that time called the WTO the vehicle of choice for global economic governance, because you catch everybody there. Everybody does trade. So of course you know by now why the WTO was formed and why all those issues are in the WTO. Number one, because all countries trade and they want to have MFN, and they don't want somebody to cancel the MFN status for any reason. So that remains the main advantage of being in WTO. If there was no advantage at all, then you might wonder why these countries are so silly to remain in WTO. This is really the reason. Not so silly after all. They don't want somebody to say, oh, I don't like this country because of human rights. I don't like this country because I don't like this country. So I cut off the MFN. So that can be a big shock. And that's why countries are queuing up still to join the WTO, even though you have so many disadvantages. But what used to be not a bad idea, that countries regulate their trade so that there won't be protectionism and shocks against their exports. And this was of course the reason why this was set up after the Second World War, to prevent protectionism. It was found that it has a very effective dispute settlement, and therefore whatever rules there are can be enforced as compared to other organizations, especially the United Nations. The other nearest equivalent would be the IMF and World Bank. They can enforce their rules because if you don't follow, then they will not renew the loan and the country would get into a debt default with all the consequences. And that is why IMF and World Bank rules, once you are dependent on them on loans, are just as powerful as WTO rules. Except that when you get out of loans, you have a HIPIC initiative, you get out of loans, then you are not so dependent on the World Bank and IMF. Although I must say, I think our main critique is equally on the countries, those countries that have already got out of external debt, remain in the policy of IMF and World Bank, partly because the IMF and World Bank have post-HIPIC, post-debt mechanisms to enable you to continue doing what you did when you were indebted. This is called the post-structural adjustment programs. But partly because the countries have an inertia and do not change even though they can. So although you may be very fierce critics of the WTO, please remember that many poor countries that today are truly suffering from over-import liberalization are doing it not because of the WTO, because they have high ground tariffs still. The Doha round has not concluded. In many African countries, the tariffs for many products are 99% in agriculture. But the applied tariffs may be 10 or 20%, forced by the IMF and World Bank, and today they maintain it even though they don't really have to. They can raise from 20% to 40, 50 or even 99%, but they don't. So if you really want to recommend a quick remedy for over-liberalization, many African countries still importing rice, chicken, tomato, etc. They've not done studies on this. They could easily raise their tariff. Some countries, like in Ghana, I think the parliament or the farmers took the government to court to say that please, you have to raise the tariff for our survival's sake. From 20% raise it to 40 or 60. But still the government hasn't. In most cases, it's not the WTO stopping them. And it could be the IMF and World Bank still, or maybe the aid agencies. So this is something that is campaignable. This is something campaignable and that should be done. If we want to revive food production and agriculture in many least developed countries and many low-income countries, it's not the WTO that is stopping that, but it is something invisible out there. Like your father and mother told you, you have to do something. You are now 25 years old, and you don't have to anymore, and you found out it is wrong, but you still do it, because father and mother are very powerful. So like World Bank and IMF, it's like your father and your mother. So this is just to put it into perspective that we can't blame the multilateral trade system for everything. Sometimes it's the country's own national preference or the inertia of previous policies. Now, this is why services came into WTO, intellectual property came into WTO, part of investment came into WTO, because the powers that be that want to use the WTO as the vehicle of choice for economic global governance wants to borrow the dispute settlement system. And that is why so many other issues were lined up to come into WTO: investment, competition, government procurement, trade facilitation, okay? And many other things are still lined up after that. For example, taxes, how much you impose taxes, labor standards, environmental standards, climate change, energy security, you name it. It is all being lined up because we have a powerful dispute settlement system. Then you might say, but how can they just bring in something? By bluffing that it is trade and calling it related. See, anybody can trace to your relatives, and if you say, well, if you really trace your family tree, I'm sure I'm related to Raja, and I'm sure I'm related to Deborah James. Go back maybe 60,000 generations. So once we are related, then if you need money, I have to give you money, because we are related. So once you are trade related, you have to bring it into WTO and so on. That's the way the word related. As Bhagwati said, we bluff the public that intellectual property has to do with trade by using the prefix trade related. We means he was the advisor to Uncle, and he was part of the facilitation of the TRIPS agreement into WTO, which today he claims is the wrong thing to do and we should kick intellectual property out of WTO. I'm saying this because of two things. The post-Bali agenda, which we have to be very careful about, especially in the last days of this conference. If we are not watchful, because we are so concerned over the current issues, they might smuggle in something in the post-Bali agenda, which we will then regret for a very long time to come. Just as the WTO was formed, because in Punta del Este, they put in one paragraph to say that we shall negotiate the following issues as well: services, intellectual property, investment-related measures, etc. Now, nobody knew what it was all about, intellectual property. At that time, they said this has something to do, you're going to Thailand and buying a Rolex watch, which is not Rolex. So surely we are all interested in curbing counterfeit products. So they put it as counterfeit products. In services, countries like India, Brazil, they resisted. So the other side said, okay, if you don't want services, can we just discuss it? He said, no, we don't want to discuss. Discussion is very dangerous. He said, how about helping developing countries improve the collection of data on their services? So it's not very, I'm not interested, but anyway, it doesn't sound dangerous, so we'll put it in. So actually, services statistics was how it started. But from statistics into services, from services into a parallel process that will not come into an organization, into it is part of the WTO. So this is how things quick in, you know about the camel coming into the tent. Okay, they put a foot and then you have the whole camel coming in. So that is why I'm raising these other issues. But I also want to pay tribute to Our World is Not for Sale. If not for Our World is Not for Sale, we would now have a multilateral agreement on investment through the OECD and then OECD Plus. It was a campaigning by NGOs, including some of you here, that stopped the MAI, and it was certainly significantly due to Our World is Not for Sale that we don't have the 3 Singapore issues now in the WTO. It came in Singapore, it got kicked out in Seattle, it came in Doha, it got kicked out in Cancun, and in Geneva after Cancun. On that last day in Cancun, in that green room, from what I understand, when the ACP, LDC and Africa had their lunch meeting, they were so angry about how they were treated on cotton. They said, we reject all the 4 Singapore issues, and after lunch they went back and said, we will not accept these 4 Singapore issues. I know that it came in Doha, but now we kick it out. The Trade Commissioner of Europe cried. I put in those 4 issues. You are telling me to go home empty-handed. You know, this is very bad for my reputation. So you must help me solve this problem. How about trade facilitation? Please. It is very harmless. It is even less harmful than services statistics. What is trade facilitation? It's all right, you know. Services, we understand investment, we understand procurement, we understand competition, because Our World is Not for Sale told us all about it, but they never told us anything about trade facilitation. So to facilitate trade is a good thing. It's like saying loving your brother. Right. So if somebody cries, especially if it's a grown man from Europe, say, okay, we give it to him. We give it to him. It is the fault of Our World is Not for Sale. Because we ourselves did not understand. We did not campaign against trade facilitation. And today we have trade facilitation on the table. We don't have it as a law yet. What is the definition of an activist? An activist is one who blames himself when something goes wrong. And therefore he cannot sleep and campaigns against something that he doesn't like. That's why I say trade facilitation is on the table because of you. Because of me as well. It is our fault. We didn't understand it. So this is how trade facilitation crept into the system. Make sure the other 3 don't make a comeback. They may make a comeback. Okay. So what do we learn from the process? This is very important because we are now at the juncture of process again. The WTO, after it was founded, had a glorious, inverted commas, in other words, inglorious history of a manipulative process that we have never really seen before. It started in Singapore, and please note, each ministerial has its own variety of manipulation, which means it is very hard to counter, because you learn from the last one, and then they come up with a new form that you did not anticipate. And I think this is something we have to watch out for in relation to Bali, because a new form of manipulation may take place, and you have to anticipate it. Why do we have to anticipate it? Because you are activists. Activists anticipate and counter so that you prevent. That is the meaning of activism, second meaning of activism. Okay? To be fair, the NGOs were behind the curve, caught up with the curve, were ahead of the curve, and therefore, in some ministerials, we assisted that the manipulation did not succeed. In some ministerials, we did not know what the curve was. It was being invented all the time. and we could not stop it. So I'm saying this because your meeting here and your activity here is going to count a lot. I'm not saying it to pamper, our egos. I'm saying it because it is true. What the NGOs do and how you influence your particular delegation and governance and the entire situation will significantly influence what happens in Bali. Okay? That's why I'm telling you this story of the interaction between what happened and then the NGO response. So in Singapore, before Singapore, they tried to introduce these 4 issues. The developing countries who were alerted by NGOs, many of these developing countries opposed that these issues be brought up for discussion. There was a very influential paper by Mr. Das which was called Discussion, Negotiation, Agreement. If you allow a particular issue to be discussed, sometimes they say study process, sometimes they say collection of statistics. The moment that camel puts his foot in the door and you say, welcome camel, I love your foot, although I don't love you. The next thing is, from a discussion, you have a negotiation. And you know the difference between a discussion and a negotiation. There's a thin line. But once you have a negotiation, the implication is that there are rules involved. The result is rules. You don't negotiate for nothing in WTO. And once there are rules involved in a negotiation, the last step is an agreement. Of course, Mr. Das would have said discussion, negotiation, agreement, and dispute settlement system, and then enforcement. Okay? So once you have a negotiation, it leads to an agreement almost inevitably because of the control that major powers have over the organization. So because of this short paper of Mr. Das, many influential developing countries said we do not allow these 4 Singapore issues plus labor and environmental standards. That's the 5th issue, to enter into the system as a study group. So there was no consensus in Geneva. The method used at that time was the Director General Ruggiero wrote a letter to the ministers so that when they arrived, they had a letter from the Director General saying, I would like you to pay attention that there are 4 of these 5 issues that some members brought up during the discussion and preparation, and that you may want to consider, even though some other members were not so happy about the discussion. So when we arrived in Singapore, we saw that there was this letter. Just as when you arrive in Bali, you are now seeing some letters in the newspapers. So we said, okay, he's written a letter, but what can we do? And what we did was, on the first day, after the opening ceremony, a meeting was called of 30 countries around a room like this, without informing anybody. There was no announcement, there was no plenary session where you say, good morning friends, we are now here, this is an informal. I'd like you to know that the Singapore minister thought that 30 of you should go into a room and just have a chit chat. No such thing happened. So it was a non-meeting of non-members, and the other ministers were left doing nothing for 3 to 4 days. Then on the last night, they were called together, and then they were informed that 30 of you met and worked very hard, even as the rest of you went shopping. And they have now produced this declaration. And of course, you have to approve it because they worked very hard. And if you don't approve it, it's a collapse. And the world media will say it's a collapse. And then if you are the one who objected, they will say it's a collapse due to you. Now, any of you want that? So many of the ministers were very angry. They said, oh, you didn't give us anything to do. But since it's the first meeting, don't do it ever again. And the Director General said, no, it will never be done again. It's the first and last time. Never. Okay, let's approve it. Boom. study process. And then this study process, they wanted it to become a negotiation for an agreement in Seattle 3 years later, in 1999. They pushed very hard. Again, this time there was a like-minded group of developing countries. They had actually institutionalized themselves. They said, nothing doing, we refuse. And instead, we have the development agenda of implementation and S&E. They had 104 implementation issues. They put it forward. The other side said, nothing doing. And actually, they removed those issues from the draft declaration. The chairman one day woke up and found that it had been removed from his draft. And he promised to put it back. He did. And so in Seattle, it was a good draft because the bad Singapore issues were there in brackets and the good development issues were there also in bracket. It was 74 pages, but it was an honest draft. And then what happened there was an attempt to repeat Singapore by holding a green room of 30. But this time, the ministers who were not invited tried to get in, and some of them fought with the security guard. So there will be a security guard outside the door, just like you have here. And they check whether your name is there, and if not, they say, sorry, you cannot go in. The minister said, I'm the minister. The security guard said, I'm only a poor security guard, very badly paid. Please don't punch me in the stomach. And that's how most ministers were kept out. They were very angry. And unfortunately, this was something really very new. It was Seattle, United States. No food was given. If it was in Singapore, you had free food. No water was available after 5 p.m. So many of the ministers, we informed them that they could go to the toilet, put their hand under the tap, and drink from there. I think that was the main reason why they said at the end, again the G90, whatever resolution you come out, whether we like or not, we are rejecting beforehand because we have been insulted. And so Seattle collapsed. They tried again with the Singapore method and they failed. Then in Doha, they tried a new method. Again, the Singapore issues were the main issue. Many countries opposed it. They also injected NAMA. 8 African countries rejected it, but their paper was not distributed. The countries that opposed won a victory because at 6 p.m. of the last day, it was not adopted, so many ministers had gone home. This is the last day. Okay, so the whole thing is not going to have any result. I go home because they have their flights. They went home. Now we knew that the ministerial had been extended through a notice on a television screen. There was no meeting, there was no decision. It was a television screen. So this was a new method. We are extending for 1 more day. Most people didn't see it because they were on the plane. And on that night, 30 countries were brought into this room again. And the decisions were made at 2 or 3 a.m. Many of the ministers were already asleep. They were asleep like this. So when most of them are asleep, then they keep feeding new and new paper. They isolated India because the Indians did not sleep. I don't know why, maybe they don't sleep. So because they didn't sleep, then they were opposing the Singapore issues. And the next day, there was this horrible, traumatic meeting of everybody, and it was said that, okay, everybody has agreed to this, including that by the next ministerial, we will launch negotiations on the 4 Singapore issues. Launch negotiations is a code word for saying we agree to having new rules. So Singapore, India opposed to the end, even though there were about 10 countries that also spoke up against. But it was negotiation by CNN. Because by that time, the CNN was giving hour by hour report outside. The journalists were there, so it was CNN, Reuters, and so on. And increasingly, India was being blamed. I was there when the European Union person who is in charge of the press, they will have a press officer, briefing the press. Towards the end, when the press was crowding around him, they said, so what's the latest? They said, you know that one country that is still opposing, I've come to the conclusion, It's not one country. It's one person. It doesn't represent his country. And that person is, you know, the person is crazy. So this was how it was being conducted. Because then, if your political leader back home happens to see the CNN, of course everybody will see. Then the pressure is put through the world media that this country is stopping the progress of human history. It's stopping the multilateral trading system from operating. It's encouraging bad people and bandits everywhere. And we don't like to be known like this because your foreign investment may be affected, your tourism may fall, your credit rating, the stock market, etc. So I think this is the lesson that we learned, and that is how those issues came in. But India was able to put in a caveat, read by the chairman at the end. And the chairman says, it is our common understanding that the launching of these negotiations requires a consensus of all members, meaning that a single member can object and stop the launching of the negotiations. This was known as explicit consensus. Requires an explicit consensus. So of course, by the time we went to the next ministerial for that explicit consensus to take place, Our World Is Not For Sale had a t-shirt which is called Explicit Consensus. Oxford Dictionary means everybody agrees, knowing what it is, with no one party objecting whatsoever. And Our World Is Not For Sale was wearing the t-shirt. And of course, all the delegates said, at the end of this meeting, can you give me your t-shirt to take over as a souvenir? So I don't know what t-shirt you are bringing to this meeting. That t-shirt had a major impact on that conference in Cancun. And at the end of Cancun, we threw out 3 Singapore issues. We left that one dangling around, and that is coming back to honors in Bali. So what happened there was that they tried the same trick. They had facilitators. They appoint one facilitator per issue. The Canadian minister was a facilitator for investment. And this method was, he put up a draft, massive protests, he put up the same draft, massive protests inside. And he kept putting up the same draft until the people were so angry and the majority said, we have rejected your draft. He still couldn't put in the same draft. That was the method. I don't know whether that's going to happen, but it collapsed. So when that collapsed, and back in Geneva, trauma, there was a meeting, and that meeting kicked out the Singapore issues. But that meeting in July 2004 also accepted the NAMA modalities, which is the worst thing in the Doha round, and accepted the agriculture modalities as well, which paved the way to Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, now some of you were there, a new method of manipulation. In Hong Kong, what they tried to do was not to reinstall the 3 Singapore issues, but to have a breakthrough in services so that all countries would have to liberalize a certain minimum number of service sectors. They did not succeed, but at the end, instead of every country having a button which they could push around the table like this, and a microphone that could be, you have a microphone stand in the aisle, it was arranged like a schoolroom. Everybody sits down. There was no microphone. And the chairman, when he came, he said, here is a ministerial declaration, and he looked at the table. I do not see any objection. He didn't see any objection because his eye was on the table. And he said, I hereby approve, whereby there were 2 countries, Venezuela and Cuba, who had put up their hand, ministers, mind you. And this fellow didn't see. These 2 ministers, having surveyed the scene, very clever, had brought their own microphone with their own an amplifier. They had brought because they knew this was going to happen. But this fellow didn't give them a chance. He didn't give them a chance because he would have taken a microphone from his pocket and spoken. So the 2 ministers, both were ladies, jumped onto the stage. Jumped on the stage when the man was still there. They said, my dear friend, raise your head up because we are here. Oh no. And we have objected, we put up our hand and you purposely didn't want to see us, and we are going to stand around you until you recognize us. And he said, oh, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, 2 people have put up their hands, so can you please go back there and speak from there, which they did with their own microphone, and they said we object. And we have reservations. But they did not stop the consensus, they only had reservations. So that was the new method I'm telling you about. In Doha, why they succeeded, they smuggled in the chairman's letter, and everybody was primed. At the first session, they were going to put up their hands and say we object. The method then was, because it was opened by the Emir of Qatar, it was at the opening ceremony where the Emir presided. He gave the floor to the chair of the General Council, who then read out and said, we therefore put this on the table. And you can't object because it was the opening ceremony, it wasn't the first plenary. So keep all this in mind. I'm telling you all these grandmother stories because we don't know what will happen in Bali. But the trauma of all these collapses, and then the new method of mini ministerials in Geneva. We get the 30 ministers to be in Geneva. It won't be at a big conference where the collapse takes place and the other 100 ministers don't know what to do. They are so angry, they have to drink water from the tap and therefore they object. So we just bring the 30 to Geneva. It also collapsed in 2006 and 2008. So because of this trauma that more than half the time it collapses, it was decided at the last 2 ministerials that if we cannot reach an agreement in Geneva with a declaration already agreed, and the ministers just coming for a photo opportunity, we will not stress future ministerials. The last 2 ministerials were very tame. The biggest event in the last ministerial was 20 young people prancing around, calling themselves Our World is Not for Sale, on the floor, and everybody was very happy because this showed that we are a very democratic organization. So that was really the main event in the last ministerial. It was you that provided the entertainment. The ministers had nothing to do except 3 round tables where they were just talking in round tables around a particular subject. And so the General Council meeting last Tuesday, where the new DG had also promised that there will be no surprises, there will be no negotiations. We can't expect ministers to negotiate and it will have a bad ending. And we don't have a result in Geneva, and therefore that's the end. Then, of course, the newspaper said the talks have collapsed in Geneva and there will be nothing in Bali as well. So you saw that in the newspapers. In fact, you came out with a statement saying congratulations. The next day, negotiations continued in Geneva, even though there were no negotiations anymore. Once you say there are no negotiations, people tend to go home. So our friend from Nepal had gone back to Nepal, and in his absence, there were negotiations on this issue. In fact, 2 days later, there was this press release, breakthrough on trade facilitation, even though you said there would be no negotiations. Okay? Breakthrough. And it wasn't that all the members sat together and went through. It wasn't that. It was the EU and US talking to a few LDC members. It wasn't multilaterally negotiated. And now we have a paper which is not official of the agreement between EU, US and some LDCs on the LDC provisions in relation to trade facilitation. From that breakthrough on LDC issue came a second press release that several groups are now saying that Bali is a pivotal point and we hope the Director General will become active. It didn't say something very explicit like we want to have negotiations and so on. But it did carry the coordinators, the countries of the major developing country groupings like ACP, LDC, Africa, ASEAN, etc. I'm sure you've seen that. And as we arrived in Bali, came another press release that the presidency and the 3 vice presidents are now urging the Director General to do something very active. They didn't say to conduct negotiations. So from no negotiation in Bali, I can tell you many ministers are not coming because there are no negotiations in Bali, to a groundswell, apparent groundswell, to negotiate in Bali. When this is better than ministers have gone home because their plane have taken off, if the ministers never arrived because they thought there were no negotiations. So this is a scenario that is facing us in relation to the process. Now, when those coordinators of those groupings said that our grouping wants an active participation in Bali, if you ask the members of this grouping, did you have a meeting in order to reach that conclusion, they will tell you, what meeting? We were not consulted. Okay? So it depends on how this was, I might even say, orchestrated. If you don't want to use the word manipulation, because I'm a very diplomatic person, you are not diplomatic, or you weren't. The last time I remember, you will say orchestrated, because orchestra is a very nice thing. Manipulation, I don't know. So this is an orchestration. So what other orchestrations will take place depends on what happens today and tomorrow. Today is a very important day. Today is a very important day because the groupings are now meeting. And now there are new players. Many ministers have come. They don't know what happened in Geneva. This group proclaimed, but I'm a minister. You may proclaim something, I don't know. My country never proclaimed. I'm the minister. Maybe my ambassador didn't tell me. Ambassador, you didn't tell me. Ambassador said, I also don't know. Nobody told me either. What? You didn't tell me, then why are you talking in the name of my group? So this is something I think that can be done today, to contact your countries to find out what's happened, and if they don't think that this should happen, especially the minister is not here, there's something that you can do about it. My own feeling, of course, is that we should not risk another collapse. Okay? We should not risk another collapse. No doubt it may be another success, depending what you consider a success or failure or collapse. But it is very risky that when things are not completed yet, trade facilitation is not completed. There are 4 major issues still in Section 1. Section 2, although the LDC issues are said to be finished, there are still other issues in Section 2 as well. So it is not a foregone conclusion that we have a trade facilitation clean text. There's no clean text. In fact, there is a South Centre paper which is 15 pages long, which says the issues that are not completed yet on trade facilitation. Now, why did my staff ask me to read 15 pages if the thing is already a clean text? I want to ask them. I haven't finished reading the 15 pages, but you can have access to them. I think it's been given to you. So the trade facilitation, I'm not going into the technical details, but you know that this, in Section 1, very heavy obligations on countries to quickly expedite the movement of goods as they come into the country. Some of it borders on market access. The one on expedited shipment includes market access because it says that it is from air cargo, like DHL and so on. You have to allow it to come in and to clear as soon as possible, something that you may not have agreed to in the services negotiations. To allow market access has come in the side door as trade facilitation. Is it costly? Yes, it is costly, especially if a country doesn't have much infrastructure, let alone manpower. To suddenly gear yourself up to have the infrastructure, the equipment and the manpower to clear things so fast is a big obligation and requires money. So you may ask yourself, if you were the government, you might want to have this system of facilitation with guidelines, timelines and everything for hospitals. The moment a person comes into the hospital, you must treat the person in an accident case within 30 seconds. If he needs an operation, he must get into the operation table within 10 minutes to save his life. And then you say, no, that's impossible, sir. My hospital is not equipped to do so. Yes, that's why I'm having these rules. Do it or you go to jail. And you find that within half a year, the hospital can do it. Maybe with money coming from the government. Now that would be health facilitation. Okay? And AIDS patient, the first dose of medicine will be given to you within 2 days. That would be medical facilitation. Why doesn't the country spend money on that? Why do you tell the country to spend money on clearing those goods rather than clearing those patients in hospital? Because if you were the citizen, you would say, I think clearing patients in hospital and AIDS patients is more important than clearing goods. But by making this legally binding linked to a DSU, we are giving priority to trade facilitation clearance rather than some other thing. I think this is the main critique that civil society has and many governments also have. We are not against trade facilitation per se. We are against some obligations which are not really trade facilitation but market access. But we are against having to prioritize versus other things. I mean, maybe you read this story, it was the saddest story I ever saw the other day, that people in this particular country are infecting themselves with AIDS, okay, so that they can collect welfare from the government of 700 euros a month. By saying euro, I'm not talking of India, I'm talking of Greece. And this was a WHO report. And now we are telling countries, not only in Europe, but also in developing countries, spend your resources on this thing. So came the developing countries and said, we will not do this unless you give us the money to do so. It was promised. But if you look at the trade facilitation text in front of you with a microscope, you may not find the word financial assistance. You may find the word assistance, technical assistance, but not financial. Maybe in some footnote, it's something that says you may also include something, but it is not at the center. And some countries do not want to commit themselves to financial assistance. Even if there's some money that will flow to this, it is likely that the money will be at the expense of some other development window, because ODA has fallen by about $8 billion last year, 2012, compared to 2 years ago. So this means robbing Peter to pay Paul. Okay? It may be coming from poverty reduction, health, education. Hopefully it's coming from a reduction in armaments, but I doubt it very much. Okay? So this is the center of the debate in trade facilitation. And many ministers I have been hearing are saying that what is the harm in concluding this thing after Bali? Why must it be done in Bali? That if you do not clear this in Bali, then the whole multilateral trading system and the Doha round will collapse, because the free trade agreements will take over. Now the counter argument is that if you finish trade facilitation, there's nothing left to negotiate of the Doha round, including agricultural subsidies, SME or implementation, because the developed countries have already got what they wanted out of the Doha round, which is trade facilitation, and they don't want to give anything in subsidies, so they would rather close shop on the Doha round. Once they have trade facilitation, you don't have an issue to leverage on in getting what you want out of the Doha round, which is the effective disciplining of agricultural subsidies, which is the main issue, and was the main issue in the Doha round, plus the development issues. So this is the counter argument that you might want to tell your delegations. When they say we must finish trade facilitation, otherwise the Doha round is dead. You can say if you finish trade facilitation, the Doha round is dead. Because there will be no more negotiations. The United States is not interested in any other issue except trade facilitation. Now the peace clause is something that you already fully understand, I hope, and you will really examine it in great technical detail. I want to say this is not an Indian issue alone. This is an issue that affects many developing countries. In Asia alone, I can think of Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, that buys food from their farmers. And some of these countries may have already exceeded their AMS. In Africa, we have done a scoping. In fact, there is a paper by the South Center on public stock taking in developing countries, and we have identified 5 or 6 African countries, Middle East countries, and so on, and given details of it. I think this is already being distributed, the South Center papers. If not, we can distribute it to you. It's also on our website. It is painted as an Indian mainly because there is a lot of awareness in India because of their food security bill. In fact, this has been going on for some time. It's not just to the food security bill, it's just expanding it to $20 billion and very explicitly $20 billion. And so this may well have already exceeded the AMS or may exceed the AMS in the future. Now, this is not something I will say in public, because when you say they have exceeded the AMS, number one, see, Jack is looking at me. So, he may be saying something very wrong. Okay? Then you admit that you have already broken the law, one. Two, we do not recognize that it is part of the AMS. It is allegedly huge and allegedly in the AMS, but actually it's in the green box. But with a footnote that says, totally irrationally, that if the government buys this thing from the farmer at today's market price, congratulations to the government, you're very good, you're not distorting trade, but you should have bought it at the 1986 price. Actually, if the government buys it at the 1986 price, that government will be distorting trade. How can you pay the farmer a 1986 price, which is probably 1/5 of the market price? Isn't it a distortion of trade and a distortion of the poor farmer's income? Of course, the farmer will give the government a tax slap. The price is 100 cents and you want to buy from me at 30 cents. Are you crazy? Not only I get the government out of office, but I put the Prime Minister in the lunatic asylum. I mean, that would be the natural reaction. But that is what the AOA tends to say. Actually, the AOA does not really say, it just says at the external reference price. But it doesn't say fixed external reference price. It doesn't say you cannot change the external reference price. If you are very smart, you can put an inflation figure there and boost the external reference price given the inflation to today's price. But that is something for the DSU to consider whether that is wrongly creative on your part or genuinely creative on your part so that you don't go to the lunatic asylum or arrest all those people who agreed to the Uruguay round at that time for being crazy. So this is the craziness of that agriculture agreement that is so biased against the poor farmer in developing countries and is biased in favor of the rich corporations in developed countries and associated farmers. So we have figures to show that actually the broadest definition of subsidy, which is the total, total support estimate, TSE. Jack is looking at me also. But anyway, this is something that the OECD puts up and used to highlight, but now they don't want to highlight. That has crossed 400 billion. Remember the NGOs used to say $1 billion a day subsidy. Now it's more than $1 billion a day. It has gone crashing through $400 billion a day. And the claim subsidies of US and EU, which according to Jack, they have cheated also. These are cheatings in his words. But anyway, even in their cheatings, the US overall domestic support has gone up, and the EU has been more or less maintained. In other words, we have an agriculture agreement that not only defines supports and subsidies in the wrong way, as we have seen in the case of this public stock taking, but also allows those that have subsidized to continue subsidizing, and those that have not subsidized, they cannot subsidize. The main thing is, of course, the agriculture agreement and the subsidies. We have many experts in this hall, more expert than me. There are two wrong things in my mind. One is the categorization into red, blue, and green, and bluffing that green is not trade exporting, and therefore you can shift from red to green, and then you can keep on subsidizing till the cows come home, or the cows won't come home. So that is one aspect that is wrong in the agriculture agreement. And the second thing that is wrong is that all countries have to reduce their agricultural subsidies, at least the one in the red box and the blue box. 24%, or a fraction of 24%. I'm not sure. I think developed countries have to reduce by 24%. or is it 36%? 36%, and developing countries have to reduce by 24%.
Well, they have to do between 95 to 2000, not anymore.
Yes, 95 to 2000. Okay? In other words, if your subsidy is 100 billion, you have to bring it down to 70 billion. And then you can shift the other 30 or 50 into the green box so you can actually maintain it. Now, if your subsidy is zero because you are poor, you have to reduce that to by 24% also. So from zero to zero. It's ridiculous. Then we said, okay, give him a de minimis, that is 10% of the production value. In other words, you are allowed only 10% because you never subsidized in the past. So if you are a crook and you used to steal $100 a day, we allow you to steal 70. But if you're a good fellow and you never stole anything, you are not allowed to steal in the future. This is what is happening in the agricultural agreement. That is what is inherently discriminatory, biased, and unfair. And this is now being played out in Bali because those countries that were very good and didn't subsidize in the past are being punished. And the people who are pointing the finger at them are those who are still using their subsidies to the tune of 400 billion a year if you include consumer subsidy. So this is why I wrote this article called "The Pot Calling the Kettle Black." You are a huge group and you are telling somebody who is trying to struggle for survival that he is not only a crook, but he is responsible for destroying and distorting the multilateral trading system. So this is the big battle that is taking place in Bali. It is a worthy battle to fight, perhaps even to die for. And the voices of justice and civil society have been heard very clearly in some newspapers in some of our countries, particularly in India. But in the international media, if you read the Financial Times 2 days ago, your blood will boil. They are saying that, you see, they didn't even say India. They are saying Sharma. They are focusing on the individual. And they go into his history and compare him with Kamala. So you are preparing for that scenario that I was telling you about when they talk about Mr. Maran, and they are saying it's not his country, it's that person. And you know that person? They are preparing that ground. And of course it's very biased. It said that India crashed the 2008 mini ministerial. It's not India that crashed it. I wish it was India. It wasn't India, it was the United States. India had agreed to the SSM compromise the night before, including with the United States. And the next day, the USDR said, we refuse, even though the experts had agreed. And we know why the US refused. They didn't want cotton to come on the agenda. So they used the excuse of SSM. And that same Financial Times that carried quite fairly the story years ago, today that Financial Times has said, as everybody knows, India crashed the system in 2008. And now we have a minister who carries forward the same tradition as that last key one, Tabarna. So they are laying this ground, and I think it is important for you to contact the media. I'm not saying do propaganda, just do the truth. And get it not only in the media in your country, which is also very important, because politicians read their own national papers, but also the international media. This is the top priority, that we have to get the truth out there, besides the social media. So that's an issue on food security. And then you have the other issues. You have the LDC package. We have done an analysis of the LDC package. It is not bad. It is not against the LDCs, but it doesn't have the same weight and teeth as the trade facilitation legally binding thing. You have the 3 LDC or 4 LDC issues, duty-free, quota-free. They said everybody will try to do their best to do what Hong Kong said that we should have done already. The rules of origin said everybody also declares that they will have associated rules of origin that will make your effort in the other ones more worthwhile. On the services waiver, let's have a high-level signaling conference so that the LDCs can say what are the services they want to prioritize, and others can respond in a conference. And the final one was on cotton that said we will expeditiously do what we expeditiously try to do when the overall situation on subsidies is more well known. And in the meanwhile, everybody also try to have duty-free, quota-free access for cotton. Please try your best because the LDCs require your help.